Hi, I'm Dan, this is at Midlife Crisis Motorcyclist, and this is the future. Well, one possible future for the post-ice age of motorcycling in the form of the Zero DSR X from the Californian specialists leading the charge into electric bikes. Now, while the car world is already quite a long way down the road to electrification, it's fair to say that motorbikes are trailing behind somewhat. Various reasons for that, some of them technical, some of them practical, and let's face it, a good number of them emotional as we face the switch from, noisy, charismatic combustion engines to silent and maybe boring electric ones. Lots to talk about, but in the first instance, let's just have a look at the bike itself and see what we're dealing with here. Now, the one you see here is the 2024 version of the Zero DSR X. They've introduced some new colours for this year and have ditched the previous cost wheels for these kind of more adventure bike spec spoked tubeless ones. That does help kind of validate the whole adventure bike vibe. It has 190mm of suspension travel to kind of back that up, a very kind of classic adventure bike look and all the kind of practicality you'd hope. But is it really a viable competitor to, say, a Honda Africa Twin, a BMW GS, Ducati Multistrada, or any number of those big adventure bikes which are so popular these days? Well, price-wise, it's off to a challenging start. If we were to compare it against, say, a Honda Africa Twin Adventure Sports, the more road-optimised one, which is similar to the Zero in terms of spirit, and price it up against one with the electronic suspension and DCT gearbox, which probably appeal to a similar kind of rider, that costs £17,599 for starters. The BMW GS range, the new R1300 GS, that's about 16.5, and the Ducati Multistrada V4 range a little over 17. If you prefer to keep with the whole kind of American big adventure bike theme, you could have a Harley Davidson Pan America 1250. That starts at similar money to the Multistrada. This starts at £20,950, which is the first tick on your anti-electric bike bingo card next to the box that says, but they all cost too much, don't they? Now, in fairness to Zero, they are apparently trying to shift some of the 2023 model year bikes with some pretty decent savings, and there's 0% finance and various other discounts available at the moment. But whichever way you look at it, it's an expensive bike, isn't it? Now, in power terms, it has 102 horsepower and 229 newton meters, we'll get back to that, from an in-house developed motor, and the usable battery capacity is a little over 15 kilowatt hours, which is your next tick against the box saying, what does all that mean? Well, in terms of range, it will apparently do 179 miles on what Zero calls an urban cycle, and a little over 100 in what it calls fast commuting, whatever that might be. Now, apparently some of the guys in London who run these as blood bikes have been getting over 200 in the kind of urban riding conditions that really favour electric bikes and cars. And the guy from Zero dropped it off, said, realistically about 140 is what you can expect. Charging, as we are here, well, that's quite a big and complicated topic, which we will return to in due course. But on the face of it, what we have here is a bike that costs more, doesn't have features like electronic suspension and things like that you might get on equivalently priced petrol adventure bikes, and won't go as far. Begging the question, what's the point? Well, once it's done charging, let's go and find out. Okay, so we've got some charge in the Zero. Let's go for a ride and see what it's all about. Now, before we go too far, a bit of full disclosure stuff. Now, the day job has been, still is, reviewing cars, so I've spent a decent amount of time already in electric cars, which is quite important because a lot of the novelty about electric vehicles of all sorts, two-wheeled or four-wheeled, is the kind of the great fear of the unknown, that it's so very different in a lot of ways to what we know with internal combustion vehicles. And I think a lot of the kind of misinformation and misunderstandings about EVs is based on not having lived with them. Now, I've been lucky enough to drive quite a few electric cars. I've lived with one for 6 months, and that's definitely helped me get over that kind of initial skepticism, or perhaps kind of any initial worries that I might have had about whether it was viable. And that kind of charging stop that you saw me do at the beginning of the video, that's a good example. On the motorway to get to these roads, I did find that I'd burn through the battery a lot quicker than I'd expected, so I needed to do an unplanned charging stop. But you know, because I've been spending all that time in electric cars and kind of I knew how it all works, it wasn't as big a deal as perhaps it might have been. Yeah, it inconvenienced me a little bit, but not by much, so it wasn't all that big a deal, really. So all that said, what's it like riding an electric motorbike? Well, given that on a combustion bike your interaction with the power source is literally intimate, because it's firing away there between your legs, and you get the sound and the smell and the vibrations, and all that is kind of such a big part of your interaction with the bike. I guess one of the big fears when you go to an electric bike is losing that. You lose this kind of major interaction point with the motorcycle, and a lot of its soul and the thing that makes it special. But let's just take a kind of cold hard look at that, at some of the realities of riding any sort of motorbike. And let's face it, on a modern bike with quiet exhaust and all the rest of it, and your earplugs in, once you get above 60 miles an hour or so, probably most of what you're hearing and feeling is wind noise more than engine noise. I mean, okay, if you've got loud cans or a particularly leery bike, that's going to be different, but for a bike like this, a kind of big comfortable adventure bike, the engine, once you're up and running, is perhaps a smaller part of the overall experience than you might otherwise credit. And actually, there's something a bit different about an electric motor and the fact that it doesn't make any noise, there's no vibration. There are other things as well, not least the way it performs. Now, it would be very easy to get sucked into some huge kind of stat comparison with lots of very boring listing of numbers as I try and make a comparison between this Zero and combustion bike. So let's just pick one kind of comparable bike as an example and look at how this Zero compares with a Honda Africa Twin with the electronic suspension and the DCT gearbox. Now, the Honda has 102 horsepower, 112 newton meters of torque, and with the DCT gearbox it weighs 253 kilos. This Zero also has 102 horsepower, but it's got 229 newton meters of torque. But you're saying it's electric, it's going to weigh a lot more than a combustion bike. Well, actually, no. This Zero weighs 247 kilos, so it's actually a fraction less than that Africa Twin with double the torque. And if you compare it with lots of other kind of big adventure bikes, BMW GS, that Harley, Pan America, things like that, the weight of this bike is actually comparable, it's on a par. So all of a sudden one of those assumptions about electric power, that it's going to make bikes too heavy and unwieldy, is blown out of the water. I mean, you know, look at the new R1300 GSA, that's nearly 270 kilos. So certainly in this kind of adventure bike context, obviously a bit different if we were talking naked bikes or sports bikes or something like that, but for a big adventure bike, electric power doesn't actually seem to be the massive handicap in terms of weight and power. Yep, horsepower's down a bit. You know, a lot of those other big adventure bikes kind of in the 150 horsepower, multi-charge and things like that, even more. But power terms, it's not a million miles out. And then we get to that incredible torque figure, which is of course a characteristic of all electric vehicles, that instant torque. There's no delay. So actually the response is very, very good. And actually this shows where Zero's experience with making electric motorbikes really comes into play, because a motor and a battery are pretty blunt tools, and really the clever stuff comes with the interaction between the two, the calibration of the electronics. And that is where this Zero is really, really slick. And I think, as I say, the experience the firm has in building electric bikes really comes into play. I mean, there's a good example there of just how quickly it picks up. One of the other things you can do with electric power is you can really vary the output and the response across various different modes and settings, more so than you can do with a combustion bike. So yeah, we've got quite used to rider modes and things like that on our bikes, haven't we? But the difference between the modes on this Zero are really quite dramatic. I rode here in the eco mode, which maximises the regenerative braking, something I'll get back to in a bit, limits you to 70 miles an hour or so, just over. But then you've got a whole host of other modes as well, and you can configure these from the app. You can fiddle with everything: throttle response, braking response, all sorts of stuff. So it's a very customizable bike in that sense, and you've got a lot more control over how the bike rides than you would have on an equivalent ICE bike. Let's just go on to that regeneration thing, which is obviously a big part of any electric vehicle, a car or a motorbike, and it's really one of the kind of hidden secret weapons of electric vehicles, because unlike a combustion bike, when you come off the throttle, your motor becomes a generator. So by just rolling off the throttle, you're actually putting energy back into the battery. So because you can adjust that on the bike, you can vary the feeling. And basically, if you're thinking combustion bike terms, it's like engine braking. So if you dial up the regen, it's like having a lot of engine braking, which on a twisty road like this is actually quite nice, because it means you go up to a corner like this, you just roll off the throttle, the bike slows itself, settles itself, just as it would under engine braking rather than friction brakes. stabilises itself for the corner, but you're also putting power back into the battery at the same time. So on a road like this, actually, if you ride carefully, if you ride strategically, you don't roll off the throttle any time there's a blind crest like this or something that might cause you to slow down, you're scoring back a bit of energy into the battery. Now, that obviously doesn't work on motorways where you're just going at steady speed, and that's where I really suffered on the way here to these roads. Was going at steady speed on the motorway, absolutely murdered the range. And that's another thing I've learned from driving electric cars, is that it's very good for your mental arithmetic, because much as you would on a combustion bike, you'd be looking at your chip and figuring out how far you've gone and how long it was going to be before you'd need to fill up again. In an electric vehicle, car or bike, you're always looking at your remaining range and the distance you've covered and kind of comparing the two. So after I did that charging stop, I was showing 72 miles of range left in the battery. I've been riding for a bit now, I've covered 30 miles, I've got 38 left. So at my current rate of progress, I'm sticking to that projected range of about 70 miles. And that's kind of important to keep an eye on, because then you'll know whether you're you're suddenly getting through your battery quicker or slower than you were before. So which is really obviously important for kind of keeping a view on how far you're actually going to get before you charge up. So it just requires a bit of kind of mental recalibration, some new kind of instincts and skills to learn, but it all comes pretty quickly. So there's the electric part, but what about as a motorbike? Well, here's the strange thing, because it weighs the same as a conventional adventure bike, it's got similar power output. Apart from the kind of the lack of engine noise, it really rides very much like a regular bike. There's not a lot to get your head around in that sense. We've got standard Showa suspension like you'd get on any other bike. The geometry and the handling and stuff like that are pretty much the same as an equivalent petrol powered adventure bike. So once you've got your head around the electric power, actually as a motorbike, it's all pretty familiar. There's not a great leap of faith there required. And I think anyone coming from an equivalent ICE-powered adventure bike would actually be surprised at just how quickly you adapt, because again, apart from engine noise, the familiar sensations of engine braking, things like that, when you come into a corner, they're the same. The way it feels through the corners, the riding position, the look of it, it's all pretty much the same. So for sure there's a lot to get your head around initially with electric power and charging and all that kind of thing, but once you're up and riding, you'd be surprised. It's just a motorbike. So with that in mind, I think I'm just going to crack on and enjoy the ride, or at least for the next 30 odd miles until I need to charge it up. Okay, so there's a little sense of what the Zero is like to ride, and overall I think, as I said on the onboard, it's very easy once you get your head around the fact that it's not got a combustion engine. And other than that, it's just a motorbike, and actually riding along in the silence is quite pleasant. I'm just fresh back from having driven the MG Cyberster, which is an electric convertible, and again, that kind of sense of just wafting along in silence in the countryside is a bit of a novelty, and it's really rather pleasant as well. There are some other characteristics of this electric bike which I can see is familiar from driving electric cars as well. Power delivery particularly, depending on which of the modes you've chosen, the acceleration ranges from mellow to pretty fierce. In the harshest mode, it actually makes you feel a bit sick. But again, like electric cars, you quite often find once you get to about 60 miles an hour or so, what feels like initially very impressive acceleration does suddenly tail off, and that's just the point where probably a combustion bike would be really starting to take off, isn't it? So that takes a bit of getting used to. But very flexible in the kind of range of speeds that are actually useful, so off the line and kind of overtaking squirts and things like that. But perhaps just where a combustion bike is starting to get really exciting, the electric bike is getting less so. But let's talk about the elephant in the room that we've not really mentioned so far in this electric bike test, that being factors like range and charging. Now, I will confess, today's trip hasn't gone quite as I would have expected. Now, I set off with an indicated just over 100 miles of range. It's about 65 miles to where I am here on top of Sutton Bank. And along the motorway, the range was dropping off quite dramatically. There is a cruise control, so maybe on the way back I'll be using that just to kind of try and score a little bit more mileage. But I did stop and have to make a kind of an unexpected charge. That was fine, it all worked out very well. The infrastructure's getting a lot better. I just tapped my card, worked very quickly, so half an hour at the services, that was enough. But I'm not sure, riding on motorways and kind of enthusiastically, shall we say, along country lanes, I'm not entirely sure I would have got here on one charge, and that's not great. It's kind of disappointed me a bit compared to what I was expecting and what I'd been kind of led to believe. And now that we're plugged in and charging here again, very straightforward, and here I am in the middle of the North York Moors. There's charging points in this car park, very straightforward and easy. Plugged in and off I went, but at the moment we're charging at So we're charging at 3.2 kilowatts. Now, if you're not familiar with electric cars and charging and all that kind of thing, let me just run you through how it works on the Zero. Now, electric cars usually can charge with AC and DC. DC is obviously the super quick charging, that you can put things up to 150 kilowatts, sometimes even more. AC is what you get obviously from a domestic plug and charging points like this. Usually it's around 7 kilowatts, maybe up to 11, and it's speed with which the power goes into the vehicle is very much dependent on the charger setup within it. Now, as I believe, the Zero can charge at just over 7 kilowatts AC, although you can upgrade that if you want, and I think it'll then do a little bit over 11 kilowatts with an extra module that you can have as a dealer option. What does that mean? Well, as I said at the start, the battery is 15 kilowatts usable. Sorry about all the numbers and maths, but as I said, this is part of electric vehicles. So if I'm going to charge it from, put half a charge of the battery in at 7 kilowatts charging speed, that's going to take me an hour. At this speed, it's going to take me 2 hours, which is slightly less than ideal. Now, because the Zero doesn't usually charge on DC, I think you can get an adapter to run on CCS, the powerful DC rapid chargers if you want. But because it only charges on AC, that does slightly limit you to the charging points you can use. So you can't use the kind of the rapid ones at motorway services and all that kind of thing. So that is going to restrict you to slower chargers like this. There are more of them around, so it's less of a problem on that score. But this example is perhaps confirms some of the worst suspicions people might have about electric bikes, in that I've just covered less than 100 miles and I've had to stop twice for charging. So It's been an interesting exercise, and this is on a July day, not a particularly warm July day, but in supposedly favourable weather conditions for an electric bike. Now, I'd like to put some more miles on it in different conditions at different speeds and all that kind of thing, just to kind of explore that a little bit more. But as impressed as I have been with the Zero as a product and a machine and a motorbike, this range and the way it's got through its battery today has been slightly less than impressive, which is a shame, because I think in all other respects Zero is really showing its expertise. And if you look at it in some of the other things we've been talking about today, in terms of its price, in terms of its performance, all that kind of thing, we're surprisingly close to parity. I'll come back again to that Honda Africa Twin, but the price, yes, it's a little bit more than the Africa Twin, but it's a comparable bike. Performance is, again, there or thereabouts, and the whole integration of the motor and the battery, the calibration and the tech is all very neat and slick. And for where we are with electric bikes, relatively early in their development phase, I think it's really impressive that the Zero already feels such a normal and polished product. So on all those scores, really, really impressive. On this one with the charging, slightly less so. But I think what I need to do is go and mull that over a cup of tea, which, let's face it, is probably what I would have done if I'd been out on a regular bike anyway. So there we go. It's been a very interesting little trip on the Zero DSR X. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, make sure you hit like. If you haven't already, then subscribe. I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about, so join me in the comments below the video. And for now, I'll say thanks for watching, goodbye, and ride safe.